We all know what we should do. We just lack the personal discipline to force ourselves to do it. When you become a senior leader, when you have lapses of self-discipline, they carry much higher cost. Everybody immediately is rocked back on their heels. The briefer, sometimes a very senior military officer, is suddenly apologizing before they've even started the brief. And so I think he thinks I'm really getting people's attention. But what happened is everybody is just desperate to say the fewest words possible, get this thing done, and get out of the room.
Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, I'm honored to have General Stan McChrystal with us to discuss the critical role of self-discipline in leadership. Stay tuned until the end, where we'll reveal 10 scientifically proven ways to boost your self-discipline. General McChrystal is a West Point graduate and renowned Army Ranger who led operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, including the capture of Saddam Hussein. After commanding NATO forces in Afghanistan, he retired from the Army and transitioned to academia, teaching leadership at Yale. He also has served on multiple boards of directors for large corporations and is a New York Times bestselling author. His forthcoming book dives deep into today's topic, self-discipline. General, thank you for joining me today on the Science of Leadership, and thank you for your service to our nation.
Tom, thanks for having me, and call me Stan, please.
Yes, sir, I will do my best. Let's get right into the idea of self-discipline and its role in leadership. I always like to define our terms here on the Science of Leadership. There's discipline and there's self-discipline, and I don't think the two are synonymous. So when you're talking about self-discipline, what do you mean?
Yeah, it is a person doing what they know they should do. So for example, if you and I asked a group of people, what behaviors would they exhibit if they were going to be good leaders, the kind of leaders they want to be? Most of the time, the lists would be remarkably the same. You know, how you treat people, how you interact and whatnot. And yet the behaviors, the actual execution varies widely. And I think the difference is we all know what we should do. Mm-hmm. We just lack the personal discipline to force ourselves to do it.
Yeah. I think that's the crux of it. I think generally, I agree, most people, I think there's some people who are born with pathologic issues that they don't know the right thing to do. But I think most people do know the right thing, and it is fundamentally just being able to do it, just being able to do what you know to be right.
That's right. And I think in many cases, people know the right thing. They don't do it by habit because they lack self-discipline, and they start to convince themselves that what they are doing is actually okay. But I think in most cases, they know better.
Yeah. Well, here's a question. Is there, from your perspective, is there a difference between self-discipline in general and that within the context of being a leader?
General discipline?
Yes, sir. Yeah. If you're generally as a person, if you have self-discipline versus the self-discipline of a leader.
Yeah. I think a leader has to portray to the followers or the people that they're working with things that they might not otherwise, because as you know, a leader's got to lead by example all the time because people are always watching. People used to say, when do I need to exhibit leadership? I said, whenever you want to impact people, but you're going to impact them negatively when you do not. And so I think the first thing is leaders have to have a lot more self-discipline because there's never moments of relaxation unless you're in a room with the door shut, nobody can see you. And even then, the things that you do reflect it. So a leader's trying to be an example. A leader's trying to be an inspiration. A leader's trying to drive behaviors. And so the leader's got to first reflect those, represent that to people, and then they've got to demand them. And both of those take a different kind of self-discipline. One, you could act the part, but sometimes it takes a lot of self-discipline to make the hard choices, that the uncomfortable conversations, the difficult decisions that also come with leadership.
Yes, sir. The hard right, I guess, maybe, to recall from West Point, right? You hit on something that so many times in my interviews of 51 4-stars was brought up. People are always watching, and I think that concept, that you're always on display, you're always being watched, especially when it's hard, especially when the rubber is meeting the road. People are watching and they're trying to determine, how will you respond? What will you do? Because whatever we do as leaders becomes the standard, becomes what everybody else says. Well, that's okay because General McChrystal did it, or whomever it may be. And so it seems to me, in thinking about that, that is a tall order. We need to be very cognizant of the fact that everybody's always watching, and we must have the self-discipline to do what's right at all times.
Tom, I agree with you. And I think on the one hand, it's a huge responsibility because there's never a break from it. On the other hand, it's a huge advantage because if you had to go personally discuss leadership with every person you led, that takes a long time, a lot of effort. And yet, if you just embody it through the things you do, the way you talk, the way you interact, you can affect people in a positive way far greater than if you had to explain it and do it individually.
Yes, sir. The old adage, actions speak louder than words.
Exactly.
Well, can you share a story from your career that really illustrates what self-discipline as a leader looks like?
Yeah, and an example, and maybe this is not a perfect one, but I was in the 3rd Ranger Battalion as a major, and we were having a battalion change of command. The lieutenant colonel was transiting out and a new one was coming in. And they took the battalion and they put us out on the parade field, and it was at Fort Benning, Georgia. And it wasn't real cold, but it was raining. And so we're standing out there in the rain. And of course, like the Army, they line you up plenty early. A lot of people came to the ceremony, but they were waiting inside an adjacent building, which is building for the infantry center at Fort Benning. And presumably they're going to walk out right at the time that the change command would happen. One person came out of that building, walked to the front of the stands where the spectators would sit, and sat down. It was a single general officer, an officer named Gary Luck. And he sat there in the rain, and he just, in front of this entire Ranger battalion, exhibited the self-discipline to sit in the rain when he didn't have to, but it was this incredible connection with us. And after a little while, a young soldier ran out of the big building with an umbrella and tried to hold it over General Luck. And General Luck just looked at him, and you could see he said, "No thanks, son, go back." But maybe that was a very public display of self-discipline, but it was an extraordinary example of leadership that affected 600 Rangers in an instant.
Yeah, it reminds me of something General Dempsey talked about when I interviewed him for my study, and that was sharing in danger and discomfort. Obviously, the rain wasn't dangerous necessarily, but certainly to be out in uniform in the pouring rain in Georgia, I'm sure it was not comfortable.
No.
And so I agree. That is a great example of self-discipline on the part of a general.
There was another one, if I could tell another story.
Yes, sir, absolutely.
It was during the first Gulf War, and I was part of a special operations joint task force that was launching forces into Western Iraq with the hope of suppressing Iraqi Scud firing, some of which was aimed at Israel, some of it was aimed down at Kuwait. And so we sent small teams out there from our forces to try to find and suppress the Scuds. Well, we had a team get in, and they got in contact with an Iraqi unit. And they had a firefight, and a couple of guys were wounded. Nobody was killed, but they broke contact. So they immediately called back and they said, okay, we need to be extracted. We need to be brought out because our presence is known. And the commander of that unit, one level up, was back at the base. We were just inside across the border in Saudi Arabia from where we were launching from. And he came to the commanding general, a guy named Wayne Downing, the commander of Joint Special Operations Command at the time. And he said, sir, we need to pull him out right now. And General Downing asked a couple questions, and then he said, no, we're leaving him in. And I was sitting there watching. I was a major at the time. And I'm thinking, wow, that's pretty heartless. He's pulling them out. I mean, he won't pull them out, and these guys were in harm's way. And he's sitting back here across the border, not in harm's way, and he's leaving them out there. And then as I started to contextualize it and understand the dynamics, General Downing knew that if he had pulled the force out, then General Schwarzkopf, then the commander of the entire effort, would have used that as an excuse not to employ our force anymore, because he really didn't like us. General Downing made the decision to leave the force in at some risk, but we had air, we could bring support to him. At some risk. He knew that if that force had gotten attacked again and hit very badly with a lot of casualties, that he personally would be held in disrespect in the SOF community for the rest of his life. And so it would have been easier if he was out there sharing the danger with him, but he couldn't be. But he made what I considered a courageous decision. Some people might say it was putting other people at risk, but it was right for the mission. And it was an incredibly tough case. And I watched the personal stress. You could tell it. But he made it, and he, of course, turned out to be correct. But it's not those exhibitions of real self-discipline and leadership aren't always what you expect them to be.
Yeah. I think this is a great example of, just as you're saying, self-discipline is often not what we visualize in our mind. When we tend to think of self-discipline, a lot of times we'll think of athletes, let's say. They're out there, they're battling themselves. They're not eating the things that we all want to eat or doing the things that we all want to do. They're focused on their mission, which is attaining whatever athletic accomplishment it may be. If they're a gymnast going for the gold medal, if they're a quarterback for a football team is winning the Super Bowl, whatever it may be. And so we often will think about that, but what you're describing, I think, is so much a higher bar of self-discipline because it is taking into context A, lives, but B, other people, and this very complex scenario where the easiest thing to do would be a totally different approach, and it would take a lot of effort off of the person, right? Thought and responsibility and so forth, like you say, but to do that hard thing when the chips are really against you is a different level in my mind. Even though I, in the highest regard, somebody who wins a gold medal and has committed themselves to that, this is different in my mind.
I also look at athletes or coaches who don't achieve what they want. And there's that moment when maybe they were very close, maybe they weren't, but they show extraordinary poise and class afterward. They walk across the field. They congratulate the person who beat them, who's in a moment of jubilation. And it's hard to do that, but the discipline not to pout, not to act like a lesser person is significant.
Yeah. So much character in those moments. Well, as I think about this concept of self-discipline for leaders, a major area that comes to my mind is perhaps one that many people don't consider, and that's addressing this issue when someone you lead isn't right for their position. So when we talked before during my study of the 4 stars, the second question I asked each of you was, tell me a leadership lesson you learned the hard way. You didn't give this answer, but far and away, the most common answer among the 51 4 stars was that they left someone in a position too long after recognizing that person was just not right for the job, was failing in their job, so forth. In thinking about that in the context of our current discussion, it seems to me there's a significant component of that that's really related to the self-discipline of making the tough call. Again, what we were just saying, having that hard conversation with someone that you may really like as a person. I can say, as I explored that answer during the study, several of those 4 stars agreed that that was a contributor. And now, for the record, this was the lesson they learned the hard way. That is, they learned it at some point in their careers, and they were able to get past it. They were able to learn from it and move forward and be better. So it is something that we can learn and something we can shape. So I was just wondering what thoughts you have about that in the context of self-discipline.
Yeah, I mean, I was guilty of that as well. And I left some people in positions, and in some cases I'd known them for decades, and they were not performing to the standard. And I found myself rationalizing, starting to say, well, they're not doing that badly, or just putting yourself on a timeline that says, I'll take a hard look for the next 90 days. But if you look in the mirror and say, what could that person do differently in the next 90 days to change your assessment? The answer is usually nothing. And all you've done is you've tried to give yourself an avoidance mechanism for the tough decision. Without question, I agree with most of the people who answered that. That was the most difficult thing about senior leadership. You could send people into harm's way. That was easier because they expected that. They knew that. That's part of the contract. But when you have to fire someone who's working hard, trying their best, and just doesn't have something that is needed, those are the ones where you have to raise up from the leader that it's comfortable to be and be the leader you know you need to be.
Yeah. I think most people who've been in a leadership position have had that happen. I certainly know that is something that I've done in the past. And it is hard. There's so many cognitive biases that go into that. A lot of times we may have selected that person for the role. And so we have, on some level, committed some of our own capital to the fact that I chose this person. I know they're going to be good, and then they don't pan out. And so we just keep thinking, no, we made the right decision, as opposed to saying, it's just not working. Got to move on. So I think there's so much that plays into that. And self-discipline, I think it is, just as you say, stepping up to be the leader that we know we need to be.
Tom, I think you nailed that. And I think it's even wider than just cases of people. Leaders develop strategies and they implement them. In the military, we say you don't fall in love with your plan, but you do because it's your plan. And so you've come up with it. You've gotten it approved by higher headquarters if you need to. You've communicated it down to the team. You've shown the necessary amount of confidence in it. And then when it starts to fail, often it is a flawed plan, and you need to cut your losses and move on. But that's admitting your personal failure, because your job was to come up with the right strategy. And so just like if you put a person in a job and they turn out to be unsuited for it, it's partly your responsibility. The plan is another one of your babies. And yet you have to have the self-discipline to view it objectively and make that decision that's embarrassing as well as painful.
Yeah. When don't fall in love with your plan, that was something that General Tony Zinni said during my interview with him for the study. And he actually is going to be a guest on the Science of Leadership in not too distant future. So from your perspective, I mean, we've talked to some degree about this idea, but just any other thoughts about why is self-discipline so important for leaders beyond the things we've covered?
Well, when you become a senior leader, when you have lapses of self-discipline, they carry much higher cost. If it is a lack of personal discipline, you say you drink too much, you do something illegal, you do those things, two things happen. One, there are more people watching, so there's a likelihood that that's going to become known. And two, if you are unable to continue your job, there's a cost to the organization that's disproportionate to somebody else. So the reality is you can't continue your role, and so you've let the organization down in a pretty significant way.
That is a major point. This idea that when you're a leader, the cost, the impact of you messing up ripples much more widely than it does if it's someone else. And so recognizing, as General Vince Brooks talked about, your wake, that you're leaving behind. In this scenario, when we're lacking self-discipline, that wake is not a good one. Well, just to kind of touch on some of the science that folks have investigated when it comes to this idea. When scientists have looked at self-discipline among leaders and its impact on leadership, they've found numerous positive impacts. Leaders with self-discipline can maintain focus on the goals, which improves everyone's motivation for the task and increases goal attainment, which is obviously really important when we're talking about leadership. Leadership being obvious, we've talked about this on previous episodes, but is influencing others to achieve a common goal. So if we're going to increase goal attainment, obviously self-discipline is important. When we're self-disciplined, we can control our emotions and impulses, and that helps with maintaining composure under stress. Poise under pressure is a real strength in leadership. No one wants to follow someone who's losing their stuff when things are going wrong. Additionally, it helps us to make better decisions because we aren't as influenced by those emotions. And that gets to a little bit what we talked about just a minute ago with hiring and relieving people, because sometimes emotion is really involved in that. The final leadership benefit I'll touch on is one our regular listeners will recall from prior episodes, and that's trust. And when we're self-disciplined, it builds trust in our leadership among those we lead. Leaders with high degrees of self-discipline are consistent in our behaviors and actions, and that builds trust in our team. So those are 5 major positive leadership effects that self-discipline can have. Any thoughts on those?
I do, because to tag on to what Vince Brooks said about your wake, and you mentioned about self-control, if a senior leader loses their temper, maybe in a meeting, and they demean the briefer, and maybe the briefing was lousy, but the leader, loses their cool and yells or throws stuff. And I've seen some of that happen. In the moment, nobody says anything because the leader's so senior. And so the leader feels like, wow, I got people to quake. I got people to scurry around and do what I wanted them to do. So maybe that was a good thing for me to do. And I would argue you build up this fear and resentment, but not just to the people in the room, because the reality is every time you have an interaction with people, if you're very senior, they tell everybody else about it. I used to do battlefield circulation when I was in Afghanistan. And if you met a private, you knew that they were going to write or call home that night to their spouse or parents. And they're either going to say, Stan McChrystal's a good guy, or they're going to say he's not, based upon that very short interaction that they had. And they're going to tell their other friends who may never have an interaction with me. So the wake is much greater than just the people you impact directly. And so it can be a good thing, or of course it can be a negative thing.
Yeah. Well, you kind of read my mind, because the next question I have in mind is some of the big negative effects that you've seen when a leader doesn't have self-discipline. Let me add, though they're easy targets, let's set aside politicians when talking about negative effects of lacking self-discipline. But are there others that you can think of?
Yeah, I've known some great officers, and I'll talk military first, really effective officers, well-meaning, intentioned officers, but they were abrasive or sometimes almost violently angry, to the point where they got a reaction to everybody who sort of shook when they spoke, and I think they may have liked that. The problem is everybody avoids them as much as they can. Even as a senior, there was a 4-star that when I was a major that we were under for a while. And not only was he an acerbic, difficult personality most of the time, his staff around him adopted his demeanor. So when you dealt with them, they were like a Greek chorus, and they would, be equally negative. And so it created a pall over actions. He got less ideas, less clear information than he would have otherwise gotten. And that's unfortunate because a leader handicaps themselves, and maybe they don't understand they're doing that, or maybe they don't admit they're doing that.
Yeah, that is such an important concept. And I've seen that countless times. That happens. So, in my field of medicine, I think in no two human operations are the stakes higher than in the military and in medicine, because we're dealing with life and death in a very real sense. And yet, in both domains, leaders or people in leadership positions consistently shoot themselves in the foot by biting the heads off of people who are trying to help them by giving them information that is really critical to have, but yet they don't want to receive it, or they don't want to listen. And instead of having the discipline to hold their tongue, they lash out. And then, just as you say, that cuts the communication and cuts their ability to lead. So it's an amazing phenomenon that happens over and over and over.
In the Pentagon, I dealt with a very senior civilian official, and you would go to brief him, and sometimes the briefing team would be brought into the meeting room before the great man is brought in. So everybody gets ready to get the slides and whatnot. And he would walk in and typically not greet people. He'd kind of look down, he'd maybe get coffee, and then he'd look at the slides and he'd go, "Why aren't the slides numbered?" Or some silly detail.
Sure.
And what he did was he was establishing alpha male dominance in the room. Everybody immediately is rocked back on their heels. The briefer, sometimes a very senior military officer, is suddenly apologizing before they've even started the brief. And so I think he thinks, okay, I'm really getting people's attention. But what happened is everybody is just desperate to say the fewest words possible, get this thing done, and get out of the room. There were some bad briefings given. There were some people who deserved to be pulled aside and said that was not up to standard. But certainly not before the briefing starts.
All right. Yeah. I can imagine who that might have been. But anyway, so you said, you would talk about the military first. Do you have any, can you think of examples maybe in the corporate world or outside of the military that you've seen this happen to?
Corporate leaders, interestingly enough, have an extraordinary amount of power. In many ways, more than military leaders. In combat, military leaders have life and death. In civilian world, they've got money, promotions, the incentives, all the things. And there are fewer legal restrictions on them. Now, they are increasing. There are more leaders being removed for toxicity or misogyny or things like that. But for a long time, if somebody was effective, meaning they were making progress with the company, boards of directors and other people were willing to overlook an awful lot of pretty poor conduct. And so I see the same sort of things, and they're not petty. They are sometimes demean people in front of other people. Mm-hmm. That tends to be the biggest, but then there's the other part that is personal behavior, taking a personal advantage of things. Because you can do things that are more comfortable for you or get you more money or whatever, because people have left hope in that window because you're just so valuable, we're willing to let you abuse some things.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of a number of folks who are instrumental, are extraordinarily valuable to the corporations and companies that they oversee, but they're extravagant in so many different ways,
right, that
it seems to me undermines any real leadership. And then they have to just embrace this dictator sort of approach because otherwise they can't really influence people.
I think in some cases it is a way for them to communicate to themselves and to others how important they are. Because if you don't have to follow the rules, if you can absolutely ignore them, there's a certain power and an ego trip in that. When in reality, that is just so harmful. Your subordinates, most of them, just resent it to death. And so the willingness to flaunt all convention or responsibility, I think undercuts more than most people who become at that privileged level actually realize.
Yeah. Do you think that this phenomenon is principally an American phenomenon? I mean, I can think of some examples of world leaders who behave that way, but I wonder, as I think about different corporations and the people I've interacted with in other countries and things, it seems to me maybe it's just more pronounced, or maybe it's just exposure that I actually see more of the U.S. context. But you've been all over the world. You've interacted with countless numbers of folks from different countries. Is this a more American phenomenon, or do you see it everywhere?
Tom, I think you and I recognize it more in Americans because we know our culture so well. But I think the common denominator is arrogance. And it plays in different cultures. I had one European minister of defense. I was the 4-star in Afghanistan. He came on a visit and we were waiting for him in the briefing room. And then I went out in front of the headquarters to meet him when the car pulled up. Mm-hmm. And so the car pulls up and he gets out of the car and he's got a overcoat draped over his shoulders with his arms not through the sleeves. And it's a very short walk to the steps. But he literally walks right past me. You know, I'm the 4-star there to greet him, but okay. And then he takes his coat and he throws it over his shoulders, doesn't look out, so it falls down. And he had an aide behind him who did this diving catch, could have been in the NFL, catches the coat. I had sort of a grudging admiration for the whole drill, but it was obviously not the first time he'd done that. And it just showed, here's the king arriving. And the guy was when we got in the meeting, the guy was so irritating that in his demeanor, I had to walk out for a while. So that was a different culture, but it was so obvious, the arrogance was sort of oozing off of it that he had some level of power and could get away with that. I think you see it in every culture, but you and I might not recognize it exactly the same way.
Yeah, I think we are getting at something that's innately human. And so I agree that it probably is that we are just closer to the culture here and observing more and able to see it better, I think. I would agree with that, I think, yeah. Well, we've talked about what self-discipline is and what it looks like. I think the question now for our listeners is, how can someone do it? Practically speaking, what are some steps they can take to build this self-discipline muscle?
I think, and you've got a great list, but I think the first is identify the person you want to be. And be a little more specific than just, I want to be a good person. Say, I want to be somebody, let's say I want to control my physical health. I want to be not overweight, I want to be this. And that's going to take certain things. And identify those and say, I'm going to have to not smoke. I'm going to have to not drink too much. I'm going to have to eat right. I'm going to have to exercise, whatever those things are, and connect them to that and say, all right, I will have to do these behaviors to reach that, and get specific enough that says how much frequency you'll do those. So that's sort of number one. And it applies to other things in your life as well, your financial dealings, your interactions with other humans, how you're going to treat people. So you get it clear in your head that when you fail, and you will fail, you'll have days you don't do it, you know it, and you admit it. I also use some other tools, like I use my calendar as in huge detail. If you looked at my daily calendar, you could tell when I'm taking a shower, when I'm working out, exactly what I'm doing. Because I found that if I put it on the calendar, I will do it. Mm-hmm. If I don't put it on the calendar and I leave just white space, I won't necessarily do it. So it becomes for me almost like a contract with me that I'm going to do it. I also communicate often to people what my standards are, like almost my New Year's resolutions, because having once done that, they can hold me to account. Doesn't mean they ever have to say anything. They just have to be around. I look at them and I go, I told that person I wasn't going to do X. And therefore, they will know if I violate that. And it becomes another way to keep me from doing those things that in a moment of anonymity. I'm struck by how different people are when they're around people that they are accountable to and when they're anonymous. The example I use is if you go to an airport and you go to a baggage carousel, people go and they stand right up in front of it and they do this wall around it so nobody else can see if the bags are coming out, but they've gotten their position. And it's incredibly rude because their bag's not going to come out any earlier because of where they're standing, because it's got nothing to do with it, but nobody else can see. And I think we tend to do things like that because we never think we'll see those people again. So we don't have to act. If I've got 3 granddaughters, if they were standing there watching me, I would never do something like that simply because I wouldn't want to project that to them. But if it's all strangers, will I have that same level of self-discipline? And I would argue that in many cases you won't.
Yeah, well, those are great examples. So the first thing that you said, as I'm sort of interpreting it, is an idealized self, a target, a vision of what you want to be. This is the standard that I'm going for. Establish that in your mind and pursue it. Make steps to pursue it. The second thing was, and it fits with this third in a sense, is socialize it. Write it down. People have studied this. When you write down a goal, you're more likely to act on it. And so you've done that with everything, it sounds like, in your day, because that's really important. You're a regimented person, and that helps you to achieve, and you're an extraordinarily accomplished person, and that helps you to achieve those things because that is part of your idealized self. And then telling other people, this idea of socializing it and making it accountable. The last thing, as you were talking, that I was struck by is it makes me think about how rude people are on social media and how people treat each other. I was off social media for a long time, and it was principally because of the inflammatory nature of so many comments and so forth. And I think it's the same thing, this idea of anonymity that, well, nobody's ever going to hold me accountable to it. So
I know people who put things on social media, and I don't really do social media. We do it a little with my company, but if you went up and stood in front of them, if I wrote something on social media that was pretty ridiculous and inflammatory, if you came up to me 2 feet from me and said, "Stan, why did you write that?" I would be much less apt to look you in the eye and be as inflammatory. You just won't do that face to face. Most people won't do that face to face.
Yeah.
And that's the accountability thing. You would be holding me to account.
Right.
And I think that that's an important thing, which social media really doesn't do very well.
Yeah. As you sort of alluded, I have put together a list of practices, and there are 10 of them that I've come up with that can help increase our self-discipline. And I'd be interested in your thoughts as I kind of go through them. One, I think you've hit on already, is set clear and specific goals. Breaking things into small, actionable steps with deadlines makes them easier to achieve, and that helps us stay motivated. So you touched on that. Touched on another one. Develop good habits through repetition. Making things habits, they become automatic behaviors that we don't have to think about. We don't have to use mental energy to get motivated to do them if they're habits. This is the case for me with like riding my stationary bike and other things. It's a habit. If I don't do it, something's off. And so I think that's an important one. Another one, number 3, is use if-then planning. Plan ahead. When we decide on what we're going to do before a situation arises, we're much more likely to actually follow through. If this thing happens, I will do that. as opposed to just being surprised by it. That'll help us to be disciplined. If they bring out the cheesecake, I will go to the arcade. I will do something else, whatever it may be, right? So having some activity like that planned ahead. Practice delayed gratification. As someone who's gone through medical training, this is something that I did for years, but it helps us to resist immediate temptations in favor of that longer term reward. The fifth thing, practice mindfulness. When we're mindful, we're more aware of our impulses and our emotional state. And that means we have the opportunity to regulate and reduce those high intensity sort of emotions. The sixth thing, strengthen self-discipline through practice. Again, kind of alluded to, like a muscle, when we progressively challenge our self-control, we strengthen it. Number 7, avoid decision fatigue. And I kind of touched on that a little bit earlier with if-then thinking. If this happens, I will do that. We are bombarded with so many decisions every day. And so if the decision comes and I've had 1,000 decisions up to that point, and somebody says, what do you want for dinner? Would you like us to go out to eat, or would you like to think of what to make at home? I'm more likely to just use less energy. Let's just go out to eat.
Right.
Even though that may not be good for me. So we deplete our willpower when we have to, if we think about it, like we've got a box of energy for making decisions, and that lasts through the day, and then we renew overnight. If we use all of our energy up to make decisions earlier in the day, we're going to be in trouble later in the day. So having those things where we've got that ahead decreases our decision fatigue and helps us lose our self-discipline. Number 8, use positive reinforcement. Rewarding ourselves for progress can help motivate us and reinforce self-discipline. There was one thing that you were saying earlier that made me think about this, is have a goal, have a target, have the discipline, but if you mess up, don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just get right back on the horse. I'd be interested in your thought on that, and then we can come back to number 9. But
yeah, there's a great historical analogy here that I never experienced personally, but it's prisoners of war. And we came up with a code of conduct, and it said, if you're captured, you'll give your name, rank, and serial number. And of course, in some wars with certain enemies, that was realistic because they weren't going to mistreat. But in Korea, and then of course in Vietnam, American prisoners were treated horribly. And it turned out to be very unrealistic to expect somebody under torture to only give name, rank, and serial number. And so what happened was with some prisoners, they were broken. Anybody can be broken. And they're forced to do something they had said that they wouldn't do. And what they found was in many prisoners, that caused a reduction in self-regard. Their self-respect went down because they said, I wasn't what I should have been. I am now a failure. And it made it much more likely that they would continue to cooperate with the enemy in the future. And what they were taught, the best and the strongest, emphasized this: every time you're broken, that doesn't become the new standard. You go the standard back up and make them break you again. Now, it's easy for you and I to have this conversation because we're not being tortured.
sure.
But I think that's true, and I do it in small ways. If I lose my temper and I act like an idiot with somebody who doesn't deserve it, and I do that more often than I'd like to, that doesn't become the new standard. I literally go, boy, I was a jerk. And I try to go back to where I was and say, I won't do that again. And I think in all the things in life, whether you make a mistake, you drink too much, you do anything, go right back to where that idealized version of you is and try to stick with it.
Yeah. I'm reminded of Louis Zamperini and Unbroken, just the things that he went through and how he was able to get through that. And Susan Hillenbrand's obviously, her book on that was great. But yeah, this idea of don't let it take away that what you said at the very beginning of when we were talking about the practical components. Don't let it steal away from that ideal self, that what you want to be.
Right.
You're aiming for what you want to be. Just because you trip, get back up and keep going, and don't let it keep you down. So
I think
all
you
right.
can't let things define you, because most of us have failures in our life. I had a very public failure. My military career ended with a controversial magazine article that came out. And it put me in one of those situations where I have to decide who I am right after that. And the reality is, what I learned and what I try to tell people now is, don't try to relitigate the past. Don't cry about it. You can't do anything about it. You can do something about the future.
Yeah.
And so if you try to set the standard that what you want to be in the future, just do that every day, then the damage of any failure you have is less than it would otherwise be. And that's the best you can do. And I think it is the healthy approach.
That is so tremendously important and great wisdom, that don't litigate the past. The past is the past. Be who you want to be moving forward. And I think when the people that we're leading or trying to lead see us behave thusly, it only increases, because everybody knows there's nobody listening to this podcast, at least, who's perfect. Okay. And so everybody knows that we all trip up sometimes. It's those people who say, you know what, I screwed up. I own that, but I'm going to be better moving forward. We have so much more respect and willingness to follow somebody like that than somebody who tries to litigate the past, who doesn't let it go, who doesn't admit, yeah, I made a mistake. I screwed up. So I think that's a tremendous aside leadership wisdom that, has come out just now in our conversation, that I really appreciate. Well, two more. Number 9, and we kind of hit on this: create a support network. Accountability with others increases our motivation to stay committed to our goals. And number 10, monitor your progress. Tracking our progress actually helps us to stay mindful of our goals and increases our motivation to keep going. So that wraps up the 10. Actually, you added a couple of extras. So we got 12 good practices of how we can improve our self-discipline. Obviously, you've got a book that's going to be forthcoming soon on this very topic, and I look forward to reading that. Any closing thoughts?
You talk about mindfulness, and I know mindfulness has many interpretations, but I would argue one of the great disciplines is just thinking. We don't think enough. We accept too many things that are given to us as maybe your parents told them, or religious, or school, or nowadays social media, or a pundit who just says, this is this, and people sort of grab it and they repeat it and they go forth with that. I think we owe it to ourselves to think about things that matter. Now, as you say, don't spend a lot of time thinking about things that don't matter. But those things that matter, decide what you actually think, what you believe. And that will give you guideposts that wouldn't otherwise exist.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to end it out here. Phenomenal way to end it out. Forgive me for saying it, but General McChrystal, it's been a great pleasure having you as a guest on the Science of Leadership. Thank you, sir, for being here.
Well, Tom, next time you'll have the discipline to call me Stan. So,
yeah. Yes, sir, will do.
but I've enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.